Thing is, what something happens to us, and a tipping point is, I'll use the word unfair because we've used that word, is this is good, that's not good, that's fair, that's not fair. And when something feels unfair to us, there's immediate energetic response. The energy happens first, okay? Then it goes to the brain who says, is this fair or not? And then it goes to the mind, says, what do I do with it, right? What we did do as humans is, the first thing that made us human is we started telling stories. So it all begins with stories. And a lot of these stories sit in our subconscious. We kind of run off of them, never really saying, oh, that's my story. And is that a good one? I realized that I can change my story and change my life. And then I realized within those stories, there's three basic roles: the role of the victim, the villain, or the hero. And we've been introduced to those roles since we were little kids, right? And those roles take place into context. And in the context of the workplace, what role has the employee been cast in throughout the millennia in the workplace? Victim, villain, or hero. So the thing about employees, without their awareness, they have a story embedded in them that I have to watch out for being victimized. And the subconscious is running that script on them all the time without them being aware of it.
Good morning. I have with me today Don Phin from Coronado, California. And Don is an attorney, an advisor, a coach. And he and I had a conversation a few weeks ago. We've got an interesting podcast for today. And so, Don, I would like you to introduce yourself, give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here today, and welcome to anybody watching this. I'm Don Phin, that's Phin. You can hear my New York accent. I came out to San Diego from New York when I was 20 to work on a tuna boat, and a kind of rowdy kid and growing up in a city. And my uncle thought that might be a good idea for me. So he said, you want to work on a tuna boat in San Diego? I said, please, I'd love to go to California. And I never came back. So I still have a lot of the vestiges of the accent and maybe some of the attitude, but I've been out here for 40 plus years now and really enjoying it.
Oh, good for you. I know. I love Coronado Island. I love it out there. I love San Diego, period. So tell me a little bit, why I had contacted you initially, Don, it was because I was intrigued by your background in employment law and your experience there. And it was one area that I really have not touched on with anybody. And we have a lot of changes going on right now. In the talent acquisition and human resources space, especially with AI and whatnot. So I wanted to just have a conversation with you about that first and just talk to you about your background in employment law, some of the areas that you have worked in as a practitioner, maybe some of the cases that you've worked on that might be interesting, and kind of what you're hearing and experiencing right now as new changes and new laws are taking place for our industry.
Wow. So that's a long story. I'll make short, huh? You grew up the way I did, inner city, raised by my mom, two younger sisters. You kind of wanted to be the hero to your mom, and my growing up, you become my son a lawyer, my son a doctor if you're really going to be a hero, right? And so I became my son a lawyer. And when I came out here and started my practice, part of the story that I grew up with is, I'm a child of the 70s. You're going to help us against the man, right? And so I started employment litigation at the beginning of employment litigation, because before that it was all labor law, union type stuff. Then we started the EEO type cases, the discrimination cases, sexual harassment cases. I handled some of the first of those. And then I started progressing up into the glass ceiling cases, representing women that couldn't get into program offices, typically at defense contractors here in San Diego. And then my life took an even crazier turn when I started representing whistleblowers. And towards the end of my career, I spent the last 6 years litigating cases representing nuclear power plant whistleblowers who complained about design flaws and had all the challenges around those complaints. And that's when my life became a John Grisham novel. That's when I worked over 70 hours a week. That's when I killed my first marriage. And it's also when I kind of just wore myself out of litigation. They knew I had never lost a case I took to trial, never. And they knew that I was a good attorney in a courtroom, and they didn't want me in the courtroom. And so they kept me on appeal for more than 6 years. And my clients basically said, hey, we've had enough of financing. It's good to get to pay for the experts and all that stuff. And I had to pay as a contingency case, so I'm working for nothing, open for the big hit at the end of it. And they just ground us down and ground us down and ground us down. And I realized the full of the justice system at that point. And both my clients said no mas, and so did I. And that's basically when I quit litigation. Okay. And one thing I learned over the years is that it takes a while to get this, but money just makes people more of who they already are. So somebody plays a victim game and I sanctify it because I want to play the hero game. I sanctify their victimology with a couple $100,000. All they become is a sanctified victim. And they just lose that money within 3 years, almost to the person. There's a few engineers that kept their money, but they're outside the normal population. And most of those people blew through it in 3 years. They were in worse position than the day they saw me in my office. And I said, no more of this nonsense. How do I get on the front end of things? And I started advising people to not pull out the card, even if you could be right, if you can still walk and talk, move forward, because you can't be in two places at the same time. You can't be in your past and move forward at the same time. And by the way, nobody wants to hear about your case for 2 years in a row. So those people who moved on ended up better off in life than those people I helped. I remember a sexual harassment case that put over $1 million in a woman's pocket, and 3 years later she was broke. And it was just horrible. So then I eventually built an HR company, and the internet was coming along, and I was always helping my clients with policies and procedures and things like that. And I got a chance to leverage it by putting it on the internet. And so I created a program with 24 training programs, and then I was the hotline for all these companies calling, and I created employee handbook builders and all these policies and procedures. Probably have created as much of that stuff as anybody in the country ever. And then I ended up selling that company. I had some 3,500 companies using it, and I sold it to my larger competitor, who was Think HR. I worked up in Silicon Valley with them for 2 years, and then came back down here on my own. And since then, I've been doing a lot of public speaking, a lot of online training and coaching. So one of the good feathers in my hat is I do a lot of speaking to this CEO group called Vistage, Viscage. I get 15 CEOs for half a day roughly. And I've talked about either the emotional journey or I talk about hiring retention, which we'll touch on. And I've gotten some 70% of my work over the years from those CEOs. And to finish the long story short here, one of those CEOs says, "You're really good. You ought to meet my wife." I'm like, "All right, well, who's your wife?" Well, she's the new head of management leadership training for LinkedIn Learning, because they had just bought Linda at that time. And I'm like, yes. And so she said, "What are these CEOs talking about?" I said, "The whole conversation has been engagement. This is 5-6 years ago." And she said, "Yeah, do a video on that for us, a training for that." So being a professional speaker and writer, I nailed it. And she said, "Can you do more?" And since then, I've done a total of 13 LinkedIn Learning trainings, been watched over 1 million times and translated into more than 5 languages. And I just got booked to do 2 more. And one of them is a very practical course on how to use generative AI like ChatGPT and Copilot and things like that in our practice. So that's kind of where I am now.
Wow. Okay. And the LinkedIn Learning programs, are these programs that they put on their learning link, if you would?
Yeah, if so, the way it works with LinkedIn Learning, if you have premium LinkedIn, you get access to all their learning materials. They have put out corporate-wide stuff now, but they were really going after the individual for the longest time. And people they don't pay individually for those trainings because they pay for the subscription to access any of them, and they either do that individually or corporate-wide. So if you've got premium LinkedIn, and you can get all the training as well.
How many do you have on LinkedIn Learning now?
13, and redoing the one on the HR Hero, and they're going to have me do a very practical AI and HR one. Because they have some good ones on AI, but they're more big picture. This program does this. I really want to get people into ChatGPT, show them how I use it with simple things so that right away they can get past the fear of some learning curve.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Okay, so and then there the programs, and I'm saying this because there's a lot of us that use LinkedIn Learning. So how do we identify then your programs?
You just type in Don Phin and I'll come up with a search.
And then I'll come back on there.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, perfect. Well, let's go back to you talked about getting out of the employment law piece of it, and I can't say I blame you based on what you're saying. But before we do, I mean, are there any particular cases that come to mind for you that were particularly, I mean, especially when you talk about John Grisham? I'm a huge John Grisham fan. So are there any cases that were particularly interesting that you want to share?
You talk about interest. There's always some dynamic stuff and crazy kind of cases that you litigate. And some of them were not in the employment realm because they didn't fit in a box. They're just crazy stuff. But the whistleblower cases and the glass ceiling cases were the most contentious. There was a lot on the line in both of those situations, and I learned a lot about corporate power dynamics going through all of that, and how decisions are made at the corporate end, and how ethics can be compromised, and all those types of things. And hey, if we don't want women in the lunchroom, then we'll figure out a way to not bring them with us.
So the CEO saying that you counsel through Vistage, some of this experience, previous experience with employment law and working with the whistleblower cases and the glass ceiling cases, I would imagine some of that expertise then translates then with the training that you provide them.
So when I first started speaking for them, I wrote my first book was called Lawsuit Free, and it said 29 steps to avoid lawsuits. One of the first things like that any place, because employment law really blew up when California made its way east, right? And so I did that, and that was the first program that I did, and I got 4.9 out of 5 the first time I spoke to 15 CEOs. I go, you can speak for us anytime you want. But then it's evolved just like I have. So what I still do with my law degree is I will investigate. People bring me into nasty situations because I've got a lot of experience. I learned how to level things out. I kid around. If you've seen Pulp Fiction, the calling Harvey Keitel, you called in the wolf, right? Like I get called in like the wolf. I'm not cleaning up blood, but I'm cleaning up messy stuff sometimes, right? And I really enjoy getting in that. Okay, we got a shitstorm here, and we need you to help us out. So I'm really good in that type of situation. I've also been asked to testify as an expert in case, and I've done that around investigations or other discrimination type activities. So those are the two things I still do with my degree, the investigations and the expert work. Some of my clients will still ask me to do something like a handbook. I haven't done that. Will you please do a handbook? All right, I'll do your handbook. I could refer to 20 other people, but they want me to do it. So just a little bit of those things every once in a while.
Yeah, we use Paychecks. It's a payrolling service, and they have a HR team there. And they did a handbook for us. They actually did a pretty good job, I have to say. Of course, we're a small company. I'd imagine some of the handbooks that you're asked to write are for larger corporations.
Well, look, they're mostly template-driven. In fact, the funny thing is when I got acquired by Think HR, here I am thinking I'm going to get out of the nano of employment law. And the first thing they asked me to do was to create a 50-state employee handbook. I'm like, no. 2 months later, reading every labor code in every state and going everything. And they still use that basic template today. They're the attorney firm that they work with will review it annually, but it's still my basic template there for all 50 states.
And all 50 states are so different. Employment law is so different in every state.
5 states have leave for organ donations, and 5 states have leave for this, and 5 states, that kind of thing. It's just all over the place.
Yeah, and the states that are like pro contract work, get the gig economy.
Yeah, well, you have the independent contractor distinctions, and that is a big deal in Congress. Rather, the feds have tried to walk into that, especially because they want to be able to unionize workers. You can't unionize independent contractors. So the administration, the NLRB, came out with a ruling that was very broad, and I thought a little ridiculous, and the court shut it down, saying that was bullshit. It was one of those things. I'm a down-the-middle guy, and when I see people, they know what they want, and then they backdoor the way their logic into it. And if you've ever taken logic and been a lawyer, you realize it's just exactly what they did. There's no logic to what they're doing. So they got kicked out of court. Now they just did the same thing as you might have seen with the non-solicitation, non-compete rules. So we'll see that'll face a course challenge soon, I'm sure.
Let's talk about that for a second, because that's like new. That's like brand new on the books. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, so one of my other jobs is I'm the editor of a risk management journal published by International Risk Management Institute called the Employment Practices Journal. And I've been the editor of that for 23 years. So I put in a journal article every quarter and I manage 3 other articles. I've done that forever. And the last article I just did was on these non-competes and saying what's coming down the pipe. A lot of states like California, it's been state-driven to this point. Right. But what we're realizing as a general proposition is this whole idea of localized employment. What does that mean anymore? My son's one of the top salespeople for Paylocity here in San Diego. They now ask him to run a whole division of it. And his work is, he's here and he has his contacts here, but he gets people all over the place. What's a non-compete when you're not bound? There's no boundaries anymore. Yeah, somebody's got a non-compete in New York. They move to California. They start doing the same work in California. Somebody tries to sue from New York. California says, no, we protect our workers. And this has been going on for a while. And so I think we want, very interesting quick side conversation. Years ago, I read that both Silicon Valley and Route 125 in Boston, I believe it's 125, Cambridge, or MIT, Harvard, all that area, they started off at the same time with the new technologies, right? Back when the internet started. Silicon Valley grew 3 times as fast. And they attribute that to a really interesting journal article. They attribute it to the fact there was no non-competes allowed in Silicon Valley. So knowledge was able to flow, where it was very constrained in Massachusetts, and it could not flow. And look what it did. That's why everything became centric here in California. So anytime you try to contain information, it's very difficult, especially now.
Do you think, though, that that's why California, though, has been really putting the kibosh over the last few years on the gig economy? Is there some correlation there?
Well, it goes right back to who's funding the legislation, which is driving all of that. And it's all union funded. You see any legislation in California that comes out, we're vast majority Democratic here. So if you see any legislation coming out, 90% of those legislators, 90% of their money comes from unions. So the unions can't unionize an independent contractor. So they've done everything that they can to give union-like protections even to employees with a lot of legislation that doesn't get into a collective bargaining agreement because they're not in a union, but they still be protected in a way as if they were. And then they basically want to say that we don't want independent contractors. You can't, if Uber is all independent contractors, number one, you can't organize them. And number two, the state says it's really hard getting out taxes from these people. So that's the 2 things that they lose billions a year due to, quote, misclassification of independent contractors.
I know I ran into an issue with hiring a woman who we hired on as a 1099 contractor, and then later she decided she wanted to be a W-2. But her contract had already ended. So
yeah, and when people get in trouble with that is if when they terminate a contract, not realizing that it's a contract, they're not an employee, it's a little bit different. Or somebody files for unemployment. That's my favorite, when they file for unemployment. And the unemployment department says, wait a minute, you're not an independent contractor, you're an employee. Anybody else they do this with?
Yeah. But they were very kind. I have to say, California is very kind, and they educated us and got us up to speed. And but it's important, I think, for anybody who is a small business, maybe small recruiting agencies or HR services companies, if you're going to hire people, it's California, New York, Illinois. I think are the 3.
Massachusetts too.
Maybe Massachusetts too. That you have to really follow, and if you need to contact them, you have to contact their employment law offices and find out
that's been one of the biggest boons to the PEO industry is all the compliance obligations that have come down the pipe. Because if I got 12 employees, I can't afford an HR person, and I have to deal with all this stuff. I don't even know what I'm supposed to deal with. Here, you take care of it, and I'll pay the premium so I can focus on my business.
Totally, yeah. And in fact, I interviewed a guy last week who runs a company. Can't remember the name of it because it's Axiom or something. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, they consider themselves an employer of record. I guess, is that the same thing
EORs,
as a PEO
they call EORs, yeah, employer of records. And those things are used all over. I just did a program on hiring remote employees worldwide. And so you've got just the same type of obligations in Europe as you do here. They're twisted, but the way most companies will handle that is they'll go through an employer of record, but they do a lot more. Sometimes somebody's just an employer of record to have somebody's name and address and all of those things. That's all they're really doing. But then they can add all the services like a PEO and handle the insurances and handle the payroll and all those things as well.
And let me tell you, as a small business, I'd rather pay the premium and do that.
Absolutely.
In fact, it was Atlas. It was Atlas. Yeah, Jim McCoy is who I talked to. Great guy. And he had worked for Manpower for years, and now he's running he calls it EOR, PEO. And I think that it's important that small businesses, and there's a lot of small recruitment agencies out there. And I think this type of information is very powerful. And the other thing too, Don, that you were talking about too, are states that are in the business of trying to unionize or help create unions or support unions, right, that are being created, because there's more of that now. We're seeing more unions popping up, right, than we did.
Are you seeing white-collar people protesting? A bunch of people at Amazon, I just saw in the news yesterday, are organizing. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. The landscape is going to constantly evolve, and now it's going to evolve faster than it ever has. That's one of my biggest things that I learned as an entrepreneur. I as a lawyer, I was doing 70+ hours a week, and you can't work that long and be self-healthy or be healthy for your family. And so I decided that when I started my company, I would never work 40 hours a week, and I would never allow my employees to work 40 hours a week. So that meant I had to be really effective about how I use my time. And one of the examples I give with the CEOs, I said, I'll bring a $50 bill and I'll pull it out of my pocket and I'll say, how many would give this to somebody, say, here, I want you to do $20 an hour work with it. But they're doing it all the time and they know it. And I said, what about you? What kind of bill do I have to pull out? You're still doing $20 an hour work or $50 an hour work when you should be only doing $200 an hour. So that whole business, small entrepreneurs using things like Upwork, I use Upwork all the time. I've typically got 3 or 4 employees that I'm using on Upwork, mostly women out of the Philippines, and they do an amazing job for $10 an hour, which is 3 times what they normally get paid. So everybody's happy.
Yeah, I did. I hired a woman. In fact, she and I are still in contact with each other. She's amazing. She's in Washington, D.C. We worked on a project together, and I found her on Upwork.
I'll never forget when I sold my company, because I always had assistants. And even if I tell people, if you have a part-time assistant, you don't need a full-time, but at least a part-time assistant. The CEO, the president, and the CFO did not have any assistants like that. I'm like, what are you guys, crazy? So I got them to hire Dorothy. Like, oh, she's amazing. I'm like, so now they each have one.
Let's talk about your role as an advisor to the CEOs for Vistage and also the emotional energy of leadership. Because as we all know, it starts at the top, right?
Yeah. So that's one reason why I like speaking to those groups, because there's more leverage in speaking to that individual than most any other individual. They control so much. And plus, they can also make decisions. They want me to speak at their association event, I'll speak at their association. I want to say their company retreat, I will. They want to train their leadership team, I will. So I like speaking to them. And I've been, since COVID ended, I've been in high demand to talk about hiring and retention. They've got 900 speakers in their system. I'm top 25. Okay, I get an award the last couple of years being top 25 speaker. And the whole hiring and retention is such a challenge for all of them. And I'm very practically oriented. And one of the things I really focus on is them understanding the math of HR activities. These people understand the math of operations well. They understand the math of sales well. Why would they understand the math of HR? Most HR people don't know the math of HR. I mean, how many people got into HR because they couldn't wait to know math? None. Okay. And then at Catch-22, they're also the most poorly managed position in a company, because I think about 1 out of 10 CEOs really wants to manage an HR person because they really understand the value in that. Others may want to, but they don't think they know how to. So they're very poorly managed as a general proposition. That's why I tell the HR people, you got to teach people how to manage you. You got to be the boss whisperer and teach them how to manage you. And the other thing that HR does all the time is we talk in cost terms. So cost of hire, cost of turnover, cost of all these things. And I've never met a CEO, including me, that was more interested in saving a buck than making a buck. I wouldn't want to work for that CEO. Okay, so they're all interested about the revenue. They want a healthy bottom line, but they know if they bring in enough top line, they'll take care of that bottom line. The top line solves all the problems, right? And so if I talk about $50,000 in turnover, they get it logically. But you don't see the right side of the brain fire. So now you talk about revenue, the sales and marketing person, they get the logic and the right side of the brain is firing because, revenue, right? So one of the realizations I had is I couldn't talk to them in just revenue terms anymore. I had to kind of connect dots. And I needed to do that for myself as well. Because I'd been reading for years Jack Fitzsimmons and his conversations around HR data. He was one of the first guys to really push that. And I really started pushing it afterwards. And it was still talking cost. So I spoke at 2 CPA conferences in a row. And I asked a very simple question. Hey, look, if $50,000 is the cost of replacing a $50,000 employee, and by the way, from my studies, that's about where the one-to-one is. So you've got these bell curves in organizations. The midpoint employee is about the one-to-one. When you get on the other side, the more expensive employees, it becomes more than one-to-one. If you got fast food employees, less than one-to-one. But the one-to-one is about the midpoint for the midpoint employee. So if that's 50 or 60 or whatever the number is. So now that money's out of pocket. And these are all private owners, so it literally came out of their pocket, right? Which they have, Steve Taleb calls skin in the game, which most of these corporate CEOs do not, which is why they can screw up a company, walk away with a big severance package and leave everybody holding the bag. And I think this is horrible what's happening on Wall Street with that. But with the private company CEOs that I like to work with, they've got 100% skin in the game, right? And so I really like working with them. And I said, listen, when 50 grand comes out of your pocket, or 50 grand comes out of one of these CEOs' pocket, how much revenue do they have to now bring in to replace the 50 grand? And I had the realization that it's not an ROI figure. So if you have to spend $1,000 to get $1,100, that's a 10-to-1 ROI, right? 10% ROI. So, but you got that billing there no matter what. You got all these fixed assets no matter what. You've got all these budgets no matter what. So I asked them for, first of all, a good term for this new money that's got to come in, given the fixed assets. And we came to an agreement, marginal replacement revenue. Okay, so what new money is replacing that old money? I said, okay, what's the ratio? It's not our ROI ratio. And they said, maybe at a Facebook it's 3-to-1 where you have incredible revenue per employee, but at most companies are going to be between 4-to-1 to 6-to-1. Okay. So now that $50,000 HR problem conservatively becomes a $200,000 sales problem. And the thing that a lot of them take away from, every HR problem becomes a sales problem. Who makes up for HR when we're 50 grand in turnover? They're going to cut HR budget by that? You're not going to hire another employee because of that? Or you're going to have to squeeze to get more revenue that you didn't have to get before. And then I say, okay, $200,000 represents how many of your clients? How many clients do you have to have $200,000? You know, if you're building custom homes, maybe that's one custom home you have to build for free in a sense because you had that turnover. And looking at it the other way, one of the things I've run a lot of HR groups. I ran the first HR mastermind group, I think, in the United States here, because when I first started talking to Vistas, they were known as the Executive Committee Tech. And the head of HR there said, I would like to be in a group like these CEOs are in. If I help pull together the top HR people in San Diego, would you coach us like with the CEOs? And I said, absolutely. So we had the head of Illumina and Qualcomm and University of California HR, all these great groups. And I ran that group for 5 years. That's where so much of the learning came out of being, these are high-end, highly paid HR executives. It was a very unique experience. And one of the things we did, okay, so let's say you have a $200,000, $1 million turnover problem that you reduce by 20% or save $200,000. You go to a CEO and say, what award do I give for $200,000? I'm going to look at you. What do you mean? Sorry. But what I had, for example, one of my clients had a big call center turnover problem. Their ratio was 5-1. She saved $200,000, which was the equivalent of $1 million in new revenue. So I said, I want you to find out what a salesperson who drives $1 million in revenue gets as a vacation. And she and her husband got, 12 days on one of those travel and leisure huts in the middle of, on top of the water someplace, because she was able to communicate her value differently to the CEO. Right? So that connecting the dots, I go, you don't have a $1 million turnover problem. You have a $5 million revenue problem, because that's what that $1 million represents.
Okay, so how do you come up with formula, if you would?
Sure. So a dollar comes in. You look at a dollar comes into your place. There's a cost of acquiring that new dollar. So let's say I didn't need any more money, but now all of a sudden I do. But everything's here no matter what, right? All the equipment, everything's here. So I've got to bring in new money. Now there's a cost of getting that money in terms of somebody's time that you're paying for, some marketing budgets you've got to pay for. Well, then you've got the whole dance of getting that person on, selling them, paying out a sales commission, then dealing with onboarding and enablement, and then dealing with taxes, and then dealing with other expenses that come out of it. And if you can keep in your pocket $1 out of $4 that comes in from the top, you're doing pretty good. And so the ratio is typically between 4-1 and 6-1, the average being around 5-1. And so I have all my HR people go to the CFOs who may not even have thought of that themselves and said, let's think through what this is so we know what it is at this company, and we can start really sharing that with people.
And looking at it from a broader perspective, like you said, is instead of looking at it from a revenue perspective.
Marginal replacement revenue.
Yeah, marginal replacement revenue. Well, and as recruiters, we ask hiring teams all the time when they get very specific about who they want to hire, and maybe they are being a little too particular with some of the criteria that they're using to hire somebody. And we ask them all the time, what's it costing you to not have this person on board?
The lost opportunity costs are enormous. They're enormous.
Right.
I give the example of a professional firm. You got a lawyer that bills out $400 an hour, all right? They're working 2,000 hours a year. They're bringing $800,000 in revenue. They basically want to divide that up 3 ways. So 1/3 ends up going to the lawyer, 1/3 goes to the partners, 1/3 goes to overhead. And that is a typical professional firm across all professional firms, consulting firms, I don't care if it's authors. And so the reality is, if you don't have that lawyer, you're not getting 1/3 of that $800,000 in billable hours. So the lost opportunity cost is enormous.
So now when you have these training sessions then with the CEOs, this is part of what you're training them on?
The one workshop that I've done other things, but the two they really want me to do is the hiring and retention, and then dealing with your emotional energy that we'll talk about in a minute. But on the hiring and retention, I just go through, I always think through the employee timeline. How do we attract it? How do we interview them, recruit them, onboard, all those types of things. And with all deference to the recruiting community, one of the things that I tell them is the single most cost-effective way to bring in a new employee is through an employee referral program. And my clients that do it well rock with those programs. And a lot of people don't put the right money in them. There's not enough juice to get past the inherent fear of referring somebody. And for example, I had one of my clients is a high-end engineer here in San Diego. Their engineers are getting about $150,000 a year with everything else came out to about $180,000. Well, Google and Apple move in next door. They all came down here. And during the pandemic, they just started coming down. All those firms came out of Silicon Valley, went all over the place, right? Nobody wants to work in downtown San Francisco. And so they came to San Diego, and they were starting at $200,000. He was like, what do I do? What do I do? I said, first of all, you have to address the elephant in the room and say, look, I know they just came down. I know we're not paying you. We're going to try to figure this out, and we're going to involve you and help you try to figure this out, because I just can't turn on the switch and pay you and we go broke and everybody's out of business. Okay, so we'll work on figuring it out. But he didn't. He didn't have that conversation. He lost his number one engineer on his number one project who took 2 of his people with him. All right. Now you are at risk of not bringing that project in, which is multi-million dollar project, and you've got to replace 3 high-end engineers. So in recruiting, you're going to replace a $200,000 engineer. You're going to pay a minimum of $100,000 to do it. Those types of engineers don't come cheap. And so I got him to actually get his referral program bonus up to $50,000. You got to put some real juice in the system. $100 is not enough juice for anybody.
Well, in some companies, I know that some of the clients we've worked for that have pretty good employee referral bonus programs, they will pay up to like $2,500 or $3,000. But yeah, to your point, I mean, why not give those employees the same money or at least a good portion of the money that you would pay to an agency or an outside referral?
Absolutely. If you give them half, that's a lot. It really is. And so $500 doesn't get people. The fear of referring somebody is they don't work out and fingers pointing at you. And now your job security is at risk. Okay. So is that worth $100? Maybe in fast food if you pay me it tomorrow because I need the money. But in most places, it's not worth that because they want job security. But there's a tipping point where, well, I'm not so if that's a good number. Then the other thing that we do is, it's like that commercial on Visa. This costs this. The experience is priceless, right? We're always using dollars. Speaking at a CPA firm in LA, for whatever the reason is, their logo was an antique bicycle. And I came up with the idea, and I'm like, you know what? What's your referral fee for an account? $3,000. I said, perfect. We're going to put a $3,000 electric bicycle in a lobby because they were coming into work still. And the next person refers somebody gets this bicycle. Now it's very visceral. Most people can't wrap their head around buying a $3,000 electric bike, but if somebody's just going, all I have to do, and I say, how long does it take to refer somebody? 15 minutes at the most? That's equivalent to making $12,000 an hour.
I know. I've always said everyone's a recruiter. We're all recruiters. Everybody. When it comes
Everybody's
to
a recruiter at our company. Everybody. That's right.
Well, and
Absolutely.
the other upside to referrals is when you bring in people that you know, you're all going to stay there longer. There again enhances your retention.
The hiring and just depending what type of labor is, if it's blue collar, I'm going to make sure they do the fit for duty stuff to avoid the work comp. If it's technical people, we're going to do a lot of skills-based stuff. So the last program that I did for LinkedIn Learning was supposed to be the number one program they were pushing out called a skills-based organization. And AI hit, and that went to second tier. Everything became AI, right? The skills-based organization I've been talking about forever, and that's how I ran my company. I did not care what your experience was, and to a degree, I don't care what your position was. I just want to know what you can do right now. What skills do you have? And you have the right attitude to go along with it. So can I trust your skill set? And to parse through resumes, all the nonsense in it, well, all I really need to know is you have the skill sets I need right now. A lot of companies are taking a skills-based first approach. They'll put out a requisition, take this, and if you get 80, we'll allow you to submit your resume. I'm not going to bother interviewing anybody. I only like to do a skill set at the very end to realize you can't work here. You don't have the skills. You got the great attitude.
Well, it's interesting, Don, because we were at Unleash last week, and it was a great conference, and there were a lot of people that I spoke with that talked about skills-based recruiting and hiring, because that is like a huge conversation right now.
It has to be.
Yeah. Well, my question though, right now, though, around that, it sounds good, and it's a great conversation, but how many companies are really applying it right now? That's my question.
Some of the bigger ones with larger HR departments, and they have the bandwidth and stuff. So there's software out there that allow you now to build a skill matrix for the entire organization. And the AI is coming into that area really quick. And it's going to tell you, this is what you have to hire for. The AI will review the resume, as you know, and rank order people and all of that, and say, by the way, this is the training that they'll probably need to go from here to here through the onboarding period. And it's just crazy what it can do now.
Yeah, it is. It really is. But there's so many companies, and that's the other thing. We're being inundated with companies who claim they can do that. So how do you pick the right software? How do you pick the right company?
First of all, get familiar with what ChatGPT or Copilot or any of the free basic generative AI platforms that are not embedded into hiring or embedded into performance management or embedded into anything, and start learning how to use queries and what AI is capable of doing. And again, there's so much you can do with that. I mean, one of my bosses is having a real difficult time with Gen Z employees. Would you give me a dialogue to help coach him through that challenge? Gives you a whole dialogue to deal with that older boss, to deal with the Gen Z employees. That's just one very simple example, but it's Google on steroids. And it can connect dots the way Google doesn't. Google will give you information, but won't connect any dots in the information. And then you go back into the ChatGPT and you ask further queries. Okay, show me exactly how to do this with screenshots. And it will. And you can even ask it, what questions should I ask you? What query should I? It'll tell you what questions to ask it.
That's insane. It is. Well, and the thing is, though, is that people are talking about ChatGPT, and I think there's different variations of that now. Right?
Yeah,
There's
spend $20 a
4.
month and get 4. Yeah.
So let's go to the emotional energy of leadership. Let's talk about that.
So I was introduced. I've always had a very strong type A New York personality, lawyer, dealing with other type A's. I was good at this. And when I did a disc, I was trained in it, right? You want your trial lawyer to be a warrior or a wimp? Take your pick, right? So it was that whole warrior mentality all of us trial lawyers have, and it's both a blessing and a curse. It doesn't wear well outside of the courtroom. And so I was like super high D disc profile, and that would get me into trouble. Plus, I had a lot of stories going on about money and who I was supposed to be and what that meant. And I came across a program called Money and You, and I did spectacularly well on it, but I wasn't doing spectacularly well with money. And so they thought that I should meet this woman, Loy Young, who was the polar opposite of me. California New Age, friends with Louise Hay, who was the great publisher, and so dating us a little bit here, and she opened my eyes to a little bit about the emotional energy. And since I'm not a big fan of foo-foo, I did a deep dive to understand physics and energy better for 3 straight years, and really understood how energy works in our bodies and in our minds, starting with the mitochondria, which are fuel factories, and moving up forward. One thing I did learn very interestingly about the mitochondria is the DNA that makes up the mitochondria is all female chromosome. Yeah, well, and it's like, why is that? That's really strange that the fuel centers, the fuel cells of our bodies are female DNA. Who knows why, but it is. But the thing is, what something happens to us, and a tipping point is, I'll use the word unfair because we've used that word, is this is good, that's not good, that's fair, that's not fair. It's a tipping point word, right? And when something feels unfair to us, there's immediate energetic response. The energy happens first, okay? The physical energy thing. Then it goes to the brain, who says, is this fair or not? And then it goes to the mind, says, what do I do with it, right? So it's no different than with a cat or a dog. The cat or dog doesn't have a fully developed frontal lobe to have languaging, so it communicates through energy and vibration. You think they're understanding the words you're using, they're responding to the energy behind the word. You use the same word with different energy, those respond differently, okay? And so humans are no different just because we have a frontal lobe, all right? And what we did do as humans is, the first thing that made us human is we started telling stories. Cats and dogs don't have stories, sorry, okay? And so we started telling stories. We put them on caves and things like that. And how can you be human without a story? Okay. So it all begins with stories. I mean, I had a story of what it meant to be a hero, right? And I had a story around money. I had a story about how I grew up. I had a story about who I should be. And a lot of these stories sit in our subconscious. We kind of run off of them, never really saying, oh, that's my story. And is that a good one? So when I finally caught up to the story about how I handled money or what I was doing with my career, I realized that I can change my story and change my life. And then I realized within those stories, there's three basic roles: the role of the victim, the villain, or the hero. And we've been introduced to those roles since we were little kids, right? We all know them. And those roles take place into context. And in the context of the workplace, what role has the employee been cast in throughout the millennia in the workplace? Victim, villain, or hero. So the thing about employees, without their awareness, they have a story embedded in them that I have to watch out for being victimized. And the subconscious is running that script on them all the time without them being aware of it. Ooh, see, they don't care about me. They don't care about me. And this Gen Z coming in, they got that script on steroids right now. If they're not being coddled, they care about, oh, see, they don't care about me. They haven't coddled me today. It's funny, the employers asked me, what do I do with the Gen Z? I mean, how do we deal with these people? I said, you start by giving them an award on the first day. Your hero award, okay? And you give them a second day, your hero's second day award, okay? And I laugh about it, but who raised them in that? We did. It's so easy to point a finger at those kids, but who shaped their stories? We shaped their stories, right? And I just really read really interesting article about the level of anxiety. Yeah, the level of anxiety in Gen Z workers right now is off the charts. They're very anxious because it's a coddled unknown. A lot of us, and again, dating myself, but I worked through college. I worked through law school. A lot of these kids are not working at all. They're taking on enormous debt, and they come into the workplace with zero real world experience. And if they don't like something, they'll flake out of it the next day. And so they've been told, do what you want. The world is your oyster. You look for meaning in your work. Well, why don't you try to get a job and find a meaning in the job you got? Start there.
I was a Girl Scout, right? When I was a kid, and my mom, there was a Girl Scout, I don't know what it was. It was some sort of a program or something. Anyways, it was part of the Girl Scout Association back in the 70s. And so at the age of 12 years old, my mom put me through what she called the GEMS course, which is part of the Girl Scouts. Good Emergency Mother Substitutes. And that way that I could be a certified babysitter.
Yeah.
At the age of 12.
That's pretty funny. I don't know if you saw the Boy Scouts are now changing their name to Scouting America.
I know, I saw that. But it's funny because I remember that at the age of 12, it's like, okay, you're 12, time to go to work. I mean, that was just a mentality that we grew up with. You're 12 years old. You need to start earning your money.
They didn't do that to themselves. In a sense, we put them in that condition. They reacted to the condition.
Right,
Okay,
exactly.
So not that I have tremendous sympathy for it, but I understand why it's there. So and then we go back to the story. So employees, I look in my litigation career and whether they use the term suspect classification, right? I love that term, suspect classification. Whether you're old or you're gay or straight, or whether you're black or white, whether you're what religion you are, all these suspect classifications. And victims are very quick to pull out what I call pull out the card. Now, it's easy for me as a white male to say, hey, pull out the card. But I also know that the people who refuse to put out the card and decide I'm going to grow past their bullshit, way more successful. You name one highly successful woman, minority, disabled person, anybody who got there by pulling out the card, and you would find one. You would find one. So do I believe in supporting disadvantaged people? Yes. But I don't believe in handouts unless they can't take care of themselves. I believe in a hand up, as the story goes, right? So I do a lot of that work in the community and it's helping me with hand ups.
Well, I love that, though, because we see so many people right now in the street corners holding up signs for free. Yeah, and I don't do it. I don't do handouts, but hand ups, I love that.
The employee as victim, okay? And look, I can remember the CEOs can play victim too when something feels unfair to them, but that's not how the story goes, right? The story has pre-cast people. And in every story about the workplace, what role is the boss been cast in? Boss is villain. Name one story ever otherwise, right? And so people are set in these stories in the subconscious and our frontal lobe going, are they going to villainize me today? Are they going to villainize me today? Do I have to protect myself? That's a script running in the subconscious all the time. All right. And it's omnipresent. Right. And in the last role is that of the hero, and who's been put in that position in the workplace? Outsiders. The lawyers, people that start as heroes. Now, Erin Bogdanovich, he talked about the whistleblower. She starts off as a victim, overthrows the nasty villainous boss, becomes a hero, which is the story arc of all stories. And goodness triumphs over evil, right? Now, in those three roles, there's this natural energy associated with them. And so a victim plays with weak energy. Nobody plays victim with strong energy. When people are protesting peacefully, you can connect with their victimology. It's a thing to do. The second they throw a rock through a window, do you think they're a victim anymore? No. So nobody plays victim with strong energy. All right. At that point, they said, screw you. You don't care about me. I don't have to care about you. Okay. It's just like the argument with the teenager in the hallway. So weak energy, I call that 20% energy, victim roles. Now, strong energy, which I call 80% energy, that's either the hero or the villain role. Those are both stronger energy roles. One is caring, the other is not. But people, the thing that the CEOs and parents and a lot of people get in trouble with, I've had to deal with it, is even if your strong energy is well-intentioned, it generates fight or flight. Okay? So when your parents and you had an argument in a hallway when you were a teenager, do you think they didn't have good intention? Do you think they didn't love you? Or did you feel it was controlling and you needed to flight or fight again? It wasn't a conversation, it was a telling. And we think if we jam it down harder, they'll finally surrender and say, you're right, I'll do what you want me to do. Did that ever happen?
Well, and it's interesting you say that because depending on which parent it was, you might stay and fight or fly, depending on the parent.
Yeah, my dad was too damn intimidating to fight with. Yeah, the 6'3" Three Corps sergeant. I wasn't fighting with his ass. My mom and I got an argument with the old man, and I was scared shitless of him. And
yeah, exactly.
But he wasn't around very long anyway. So, so that whole strong energy is their blessing and their curse. So I teach them how to help people with weak energy move up, and with strong energy to move down. And what I want them to do is a metaphor I use. I want them to play 40-40. So if there's a field, most people said what's fair is we go 50-50. You get half the cookie, I get half the cookie. So I do these physical exercises where they have them stand toe-to-toe, and I say, how's that feel? They're like, too close, right? So up to what feels right, and everybody pretty much goes arm's length. And that's the metaphor of 40-40. I said, this room in the middle is the room for the co-creation, the innovation, for the dance. And if you're out of 40-40 in relationships, you'll see the problem with that. Somebody be playing victim roles, negative hero roles, somebody turn completely villainous. But anytime you're out of that role where you can have a dialogue, and I even bring tuning forks with me, and I have one right here, and I show how resonance works with a tuning fork, and that's 40-40 is a metaphor for how resonance works. And if anybody's interested in that book, they just go to my website. They can download it on the free tools page. All my books I put up there in PDF.
Wow. Okay, so what is your website? It's
just my name, donphin.com, DONPHIN.
And then what link, is there just an obvious link there for your books?
Yeah, the free tools, and there's bazillions of them. So when I sold my company to Think HR, they didn't want they only wanted my compliance tools. I'm like, I got all these other amazing HR tools. And no, we're not interested. I said, what do you want me to do with it? Whatever you want, just don't compete against us. So I just threw it all on the website.
This is great information. Don, thank you so much. I mean, this has been a fabulous.
Yeah, I enjoyed it myself.
No, and I really enjoyed learning. I've taken copious notes here during our call. So thank you for the training you've given me as well. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
All right, have me speak at your next community event. There you go. All right.
Okay, perfect. I love that. All right, Don, thank you.